Dr. Alina Voss had always hated the way her mother-in-law made tea, weak, tepid, and with just a whisper of lemon that did nothing to cut through the bitterness. She sat at the rickety wooden table in her small cabin near the base of the Black Ridge Mountains, staring at the overcast sky through the window, half expecting another useless phone call about funding cuts. The knock at her door was sharp, unexpected. She wasn't due to meet her team for another hour. When she pulled it open, she found Professor Hale standing there, his hiking boots caked with dried mud, his face flushed from exertion. He held out a water-stained notebook with a cracked leather cover. "Found this near the eastern trailhead," he said, breathless. "You need to see it." Alina took the book, flipping past pages of cramped, feverish handwriting. Sketches of cave entrances, symbols she didn't recognize, and toward the middle, a rough map leading deep into the mountain range. The ink was smudged in places, as if written in a hurry or under duress. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. "They're not dormant, they're waiting." She looked up. Hale's expression was unreadable, but his fingers tapped nervously against his thigh. "Who wrote this?" Alina asked. "Dr. Lyle Carter," Hale said quietly. "His team went up there last month. They never came back." Alina's fingers tightened around the journal. The cabin's heater clicked off, leaving the room too quiet. Outside, the wind hissed through the pines. "Carter was researching the Anasazi migration patterns," she said, more to herself than to Hale. "He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the eastern ridge." Hale shifted his weight. "That's not the strangest part." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a Polaroid, its edges curled with damp. The image showed a cave wall, its surface covered in ochre handprints and crude figures, humanoid but elongated, their limbs twisted like roots. At the center, a crude circle had been scraped into the stone, filled with symbols that made Alina's pulse stutter. She'd seen those before, in fragments, in nightmares. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked. "Half a mile from where the trail splits near Dead Man's Creek." Hale's voice dropped. "There were other things, a campsite torn apart. One of the tents was shredded like something ripped it open from the inside, and he hesitated. The ground was covered in footprints, but they weren't human, too narrow, too deep." Alina exhaled through her nose. The funding committee would laugh her out of the room if she suggested canceling the expedition over this. But Carter's journal trembled in her hands, its pages smelling of damp earth and something metallic. Blood. She flipped back to the last legible entry. Alina's breath caught as she read the jagged script. The paintings weren't warnings. They were instructions. "The seal isn't stone, it's flesh." The words blurred as her vision tunneled. Hale was saying something about radio silence, about how Carter's last transmission had been nothing but static and what might have been screaming. She stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floorboards. "Get the team together, now." Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, too sharp, too loud. Hale blinked but didn't argue. As he turned to leave, Alina grabbed her field satchel, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her grandfather's old hunting knife tucked inside. She'd never used it, never needed to. The eastern ridge was colder than forecasted. By the time they reached Dead Man's Creek, frost glittered on the pine needles despite it being early September. Alina's grad student, Raj, pointed to the disturbed earth near the creek bed, not footprints but furrows, as if something heavy had been dragged toward the tree line. Something with claws. "No bear did that," muttered Dr. Chen, their geologist, kicking at the dirt. Her usual smirk was gone. The team fell silent as they approached the remains of Carter's camp. The shredded tent flapped in the wind like a gutted animal. Inside, a single canteen lay overturned, its contents long since seeped into the ground. Raj picked it up, then recoiled. "It's sticky." Alina crouched beside Raj, her gloves brushing the canteen's surface. The stickiness wasn't just water, it was viscous, clinging to her fingers like sap. She held her hand up to the weak sunlight filtering through the pines. The substance was dark, almost black. "Not blood," she murmured, though the way it stretched between her fingers made her stomach twist. "Too thick." Dr. Chen knelt beside her, pulling a small vial from her pack. "Let me get a sample." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she scraped the goo into the glass. "Whatever this is, it's organic. Maybe fungal." She sealed the vial, but not before Alina caught the scent. Earthy, yes, but underneath, something rancid, like meat left too long in the sun. A twig snapped in the trees. The team froze. Hale's hand went to his hunting knife, his breath fogging in the cold air. Alina motioned for silence, her pulse hammering in her throat. The forest had gone eerily still, as if the wind itself was holding its breath. Then a sound. Not an animal, not quite human. A wet, guttural clicking, like tongues peeling away from teeth. Raj's flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the base of a towering pine. The bark was gouged, deep grooves running vertically down the trunk. Alina stepped closer, her boots crunching on frostbitten needles. The marks weren't random, they formed symbols, crude but unmistakable. The same ones from Carter's journal, the same ones from the cave painting. "They're here," Hale whispered. The clicking noise stopped. For 3 heartbeats there was nothing but the creak of branches in the wind. Then a whisper, not from the trees but between them. A voice that wasn't a voice, syllables that slithered into Alina's ears like oil. Raj's flashlight flickered. The beam wavered, then died completely, plunging them into near darkness. Only the pale glow of the moon filtered through the pines, casting jagged shadows across the torn earth. "Move," Alina hissed. The team didn't need telling twice. They bolted for the tree line, boots slipping on frost and loose soil. Behind them the clicking resumed, louder now, syncopated, a grotesque mockery of laughter. Alina risked a glance back. The shadows moved, not just shifting with the wind, but pulsing, elongating, stretching toward them like fingers. Chen stumbled, her foot catching on a root. Hale hauled her up, but not before Alina saw it. A shape, low to the ground, skittering sideways on too many limbs. Its movement was wrong, disjointed, as if its bones weren't connected right. Moonlight glinted off wet, black eyes. Too many eyes. "The cave," Alina gasped, fumbling for Carter's journal in her satchel. "The symbols, they're wards. We need to get to the cave." The team veered east, toward the ridge where Carter's map had marked the entrance. The forest thinned, giving way to scree and jagged rock. The air grew thicker, colder, clinging to their skin like damp cloth. Raj was the first to spot the narrow fissure in the cliff face, a dark slit, barely wide enough to squeeze through. The mouth of the cave was littered with bones. Small animals, mostly. Some looked recent. The cave exhaled. A slow, stale breath of earth and something older, something that shouldn't have lungs. Alina's headlamp flickered as she squeezed through the fissure, the rock pressing against her ribs like a vice. The beam illuminated the walls, ochre handprints, charcoal figures locked in a dance that made her stomach lurch. The figures weren't human. Their limbs bent backward, their mouths stretched too wide, their fingers tapering into claws. At the center of the mural, a circle of symbols pulsed under her light, the paint still glistening as if fresh. Raj's voice wavered behind her. "That's not possible. These pigments should have dried centuries ago." He reached out, fingertips grazing the wall. The moment he touched the symbols, the cave groaned, a sound like stone grinding against bone. Chen yanked him back as the ground trembled, dislodging pebbles from the ceiling. Hale's knife glinted in the dim light. "We shouldn't be here." Alina ignored him, stepping deeper into the chamber. Her boot kicked something metallic, a rusted lantern, its glass shattered. Next to it, a pickaxe lay abandoned, its handle snapped clean in two. Carter's team had been here, and they'd fought. A whisper curled around her ear, not from the team, not from the wind. It came from the dark ahead where the tunnel dipped into blackness. A voice, no, voices murmuring in a language that slithered between syllables. Alina's pulse thundered. She knew those words. She'd heard them before in the fragments of Anasazi chant recordings Carter had sent her last summer, except these weren't recordings. These were alive. The whispers coiled around Alina's spine like smoke. She pressed a gloved hand to the cave wall to steady herself, the stone unnaturally warm beneath her touch. The symbols pulsed under her headlamp's beam, the ochre paint shifting like liquid. Raj's breath hitched behind her. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "The handprints, they moved." Chen's vial clattered to the ground, the black substance inside slithering up the glass like a living thing. Hale lunged forward, stomping on it with a curse, but the vial was already empty. The shadows at the edges of the chamber deepened, stretching toward them in jagged increments. The whispering crescendoed, syllables overlapping into a chorus that made Alina's teeth ache. Then silence. The cave exhaled. A figure stepped into the light. Carter's face was a grotesque parody of the man Alina remembered. His skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones, his lips peeled back in a rictus grin that didn't match the hollow terror in his eyes. The whispers pouring from his throat weren't his own. They slithered between his teeth like serpents, his jaw unhinging slightly with each syllable. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers spasming as if pulling invisible strings. "Lyle," Alina's voice cracked. The cave's walls pulsed in response, the ochre handprints glistening wetly. Carter's head tilted, his neck emitting a wet pop. His lips moved again, but the voice that emerged was layered, something ancient and guttural beneath his own. "You shouldn't have come back." Raj stumbled backward, his boots skidding on loose shale. Hale's knife was raised, but his arm trembled. Chen's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers digging into Alina's sleeve. Carter, or what was left of him, took another step forward. His hiking boots were shredded, toes visible through the leather, the nails blackened and curled like claws. Alina's stomach lurched as she noticed the stains on his shirt, not mud, but something darker, something that dripped. The whispers crescendoed, the cave's walls vibrating with the sound. Carter's mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, his tongue lolling like a rotten fruit. Behind him, the shadows twisted. Shapes detached from the darkness, elongated limbs, too many joints, eyes that reflected the dim headlamp light like polished obsidian. One of them scuttled forward on all fours, its spine arching unnaturally, its head rotating to regard them with a smile that split its face ear to ear. "The seal," Carter's voice rasped, his words overlapping with the thing's whispers. "You broke it." His hand twitched toward the mural where the circle of symbols now pulsed like a heartbeat. The paint moved, slithering across the stone like living tendrils. Alina's vision swam. She'd seen those symbols before, not in Carter's notes, not in any academic text. In her dreams. In the seconds between waking and sleep when the dark felt alive. The figure stepped forward, revealing Carter's gaunt face, but his lips moved out of sync with the whispers echoing from his throat. His jaw unhinged slightly, the lower half dropping too far, too loose, like a marionette with its strings cut. The whispers slithered out between his teeth, wet and guttural, while his own voice, thin and frayed, struggled beneath them. "Run," he managed before his mouth snapped shut with a click. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, flickered toward the tunnel behind him. A plea, a warning. Alina's pulse hammered in her ears. The cave walls pulsed around them, the ochre handprints glistening as if freshly pressed. Raj's breath hitched beside her. "That's not Carter," he whispered. "Not anymore." The thing wearing Carter's skin tilted its head, the motion too fluid, too wrong. Its neck cracked audibly, the sound like snapping twigs. The whispers swelled, filling the chamber with syllables that prickled against Alina's skin like static. Hale lunged forward, his knife flashing. The blade sank into Carter's shoulder with a wet thud. No blood. Only a thick black ooze seeped from the wound, dripping sluggishly onto the stone floor. Carter didn't flinch. His lips curled into a smile that stretched beyond human limits, his teeth elongating, sharpening. The whispers crescendoed, drowning out Hale's curse as Carter's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around Hale's wrist with bone-crushing force. The skin there blackened instantly, the veins rising like dark roots beneath the surface. Chen screamed. Raj grabbed Alina's arm, yanking her back as Hale collapsed, his knees hitting the ground with a sickening crack. Carter the thing leaned down, its mouth unhinging fully now, the whispers coalescing into a single guttural word. "Mine." Hale's body convulsed, his back arching unnaturally before his spine snapped with a sound like splitting wood. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opening in a silent scream as his skin rippled, as if something moved beneath it. Aliner's stomach lurched. The cave walls trembled, the symbols writhing like live wires. Raj's grip on her arm tightened. "The tunnel," he shouted, pointing to a narrow fissure behind them. Chen didn't hesitate. She bolted, her boots skidding on loose shale. Alina followed, her lungs burning, her headlamp flickering as shadows reached for them from the walls. Behind her, Hale's body twitched, his limbs elongating, his fingers curling into claws. Carter watched them flee, his head tilting, his smile widening until it split his face ear to ear. Raj's shoulder slammed into Alina's back as they funneled into the fissure, too narrow, too dark, the rock pressing against their ribs like a coffin lid. Behind them, Hale's screams had dissolved into wet, clicking laughter. Chen's headlamp flickered ahead, illuminating the tunnel walls where ancient handprints smeared downward like something had been dragged deeper. The air reeked of copper and damp stone, thick enough to coat Alina's tongue. A scrape of bone on rock. Alina twisted, her headlamp catching Hale, not Hale * crawling after them on limbs that bent the wrong way at every joint. His jaw hung slack, tendons snapping as it unhinged further, blackened lips peeling back from teeth that had grown too long. Alina's boot caught on a loose stone. She fell hard, her knee striking bedrock. Raj hauled her up, his fingers digging into her forearm hard enough to bruise. Chen's voice ricocheted off the tunnel walls. "There's a chamber ahead, move *." The fissure opened abruptly, spilling them into a cavern so vast the headlamps couldn't reach the ceiling. The floor was littered with bones, some animal, some decidedly human, their femurs snapped cleanly as if chewed. Alina's breath fogged in the frigid air. The whispers hadn't stopped. They dripped from the stalactites overhead, echoing from every direction. Raj gasped. The far wall was covered in the same ochre handprints, but these formed a perfect ring around a recessed alcove. Inside, a stone slab lay cracked in two, the edges blackened as if scorched. Chen staggered toward it, her boots crunching on brittle ribs. "This is it," she whispered. "The seal." Something clattered in the tunnel behind them. Hale, or what was left of him, emerged, his spine twisting like a wrung rag. His mouth opened, but the voice that emerged wasn't his. It was Carter's. "You shouldn't have looked," it rasped, syllables slithering between his teeth. Behind him, shadows detached from the tunnel mouth. Too many limbs, too many eyes, their movements a grotesque parody of human grace. Chen's fingers flew over the broken slab, tracing the scorch marks with a trembling urgency. "It's not just broken," she whispered. "It's feeding them." The whispers intensified, wrapping around the chamber like a noose. Alina's headlamp flickered, casting jagged shadows that skittered away from Hale's contorted form as he lurched forward, joints popping with each unnatural step. Raj grabbed Alina's shoulder, his breath hot and panicked against her ear. "The journal Carter mentioned a ritual." His voice cracked as Hale's head rotated a full 180 degrees, blackened lips peeling back in a grin that split his cheeks. The thing wearing Hale's skin hissed, a sound like steam escaping a corpse. Alina fumbled for Carter's journal, the pages sticking together with that same viscous black substance. Her gloves slipped as she flipped to the last legible entry. The ink had bled, but one phrase remained clear. "Blood seals what blood unbound." Her stomach twisted. Chen's head snapped up, her face bone-white in the dim light. "No," she breathed. "Not just any blood. Ours." The realization hit Alina like a physical blow. Carter's team had broken the seal by bleeding here. Now the cave demanded repayment in kind. Hale's body convulsed, his ribcage splitting open with a wet crunch. Something pulsed inside, black and glistening. The whispers became a roar, the cave walls vibrating with hunger. Raj didn't hesitate. He slashed his palm open on a jagged stone, blood spattering the slab. The reaction was instantaneous. The scorch marks flared crimson, the whispers shrieking into silence as the shadows recoiled. Hale's body collapsed like a marionette with cut strings, the thing inside him shriveling to ash. But the relief was short-lived. The cavern's temperature plummeted, their breath frosting in the air. The real fight wasn't over. The seal needed more. The slab drank Raj's blood greedily, the scorch marks flaring brighter, but the whispers didn't stop. They coiled around the chamber like a living thing, pressing against Alina's eardrums until she thought they might burst. Chen's hand clamped over Raj's bleeding palm, her face grim. "It's not enough," she hissed. "It needs all of us." A wet snap echoed from the tunnel. Carter's silhouette emerged, his limbs twitching like a puppet on tangled strings. Behind him, the shadows moved, not just darkness, but shapes with too many joints, their eyes reflecting the dim light like polished stones. Alina's throat tightened. They were out of time. Chen didn't wait. She dragged her forearm across a sharp edge of the slab, hissing as blood welled in the cut. The moment her blood touched the stone, the cavern groaned, the walls shuddering as if something deep within recoiled. The whispers fractured into screams, the sound so visceral Alina felt it in her teeth. Carter's body spasmed, his jaw unhinging with a wet pop as something black and writhing slithered out from between his lips. Alina's hands shook as she pressed her own palm to the slab's edge. The pain was sharp, immediate, but the blood didn't drip. It flowed, drawn into the stone as if siphoned. The slab pulsed under her touch, the scorch marks igniting into a web of crimson light. The shadows at the edges of the chamber writhed, their forms fraying at the edges like smoke in the wind. The slab drank Alina's blood like a starving thing, the crimson light spreading in jagged veins across the stone. The whispers twisted into shrieks, the cave itself convulsing around them as the shadows clawed at the edges of the chamber, their forms dissolving like ash in a gale. Carter's body collapsed, his skin shriveling to parchment, the thing that had worn him crumbling to dust between his teeth. Raj staggered back, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. "It's working," he gasped, but his voice was drowned out by the cavern's roar, a sound like a mountain waking from a 1,000-year sleep. The slab trembled, the cracks in its surface glowing hotter, brighter, until the light seared Alina's retinas. She tried to pull her hand away, but the stone held her fast, her blood still flowing, too much blood. Chen's knees buckled beside her, her face gray as her life spilled into the slab. Then silence. The light dimmed. The slab sealed itself with a sound like bones knitting. The whispers were gone. Only the drip of water echoed in the chamber, the air thick with the scent of iron and burnt stone. Alina wrenched her hand free, the wound already crusting over, too quick, too wrong. Chen slumped against the slab, her breath shallow. Raj's fingers brushed her shoulder, but she didn't stir. A wet cough. Chen's cough sprayed flecks of crimson across the slab. Her eyelids fluttered, the whites shot through with ruptured veins. "It's still here," she rasped, her fingers clawing at the stone. "The seal's not complete." Raj's head snapped toward the tunnel mouth. Shadows pooled there, thicker than before, coalescing. A shape detached itself from the dark, all knotted muscle and jointless limbs, its skin the color of a bruise. It moved in stops and starts like a film missing frames. Alina's pulse stuttered. One got out. The thing's head tilted, the motion grotesquely avian. Its mouth split vertically, rows of needle teeth glistening. Chen's breath hitched. "The ritual needs a full sacrifice," she whispered. "We only gave it blood." Raj's jaw tightened. He lunged for Hale's abandoned knife just as the thing scuttled forward, its talons scoring grooves in the stone. Alina grabbed Chen's arm, hauling her backward. The slab beneath them vibrated, the scorch marks flickering weakly. "Again," Chen gasped, pressing her bleeding palm to the stone. The slab drank greedily, but the marks didn't brighten. The thing paused, cocking its head as if amused. Raj's knife struck its shoulder. Black fluid oozed, but the wound sealed instantly. The cave exhaled. Alina felt it first, a tremor through the stone, a sigh against her nape. The thing in the shadows didn't react. It simply watched, its head tilting further, the vertebrae in its neck cracking like dry twigs. Raj's knife clattered to the ground, his fingers spasming as black tendrils of corruption spiderwebbed up his wrist from where he'd nicked the creature. Chen coughed again, blood flecking her lips. "It's learning," she wheezed. Her hand slipped from the slab, leaving a smeared print. The seal, it needs more than blood now. It needs. The thing moved. One moment it was crouched at the tunnel mouth. The next, it was inside Raj's shadow, its talons hooked through his ribcage from behind. Raj didn't scream. His mouth opened, but only a wet gurgle emerged as the thing peeled him apart like overripe fruit, his spine snapping audibly. Alina's vision whited out for a second, the sound of tearing meat drowning out Chen's gasp. Alina's scream died in her throat as Raj's body hit the ground with a wet thud. The creature stepped over him, its talons clicking against stone. Chen's fingers dug into Alina's arm, her breath ragged. "It wants the rest," she whispered. "The seal needs life." The thing's head swiveled toward them, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. Alina's mind raced, Carter's journal, the cave paintings, the symbols. Blood seals what blood unbound. But Chen was right. They'd only given it blood, not enough. Chen shoved Alina backward with surprising strength. "Run," she hissed, then lunged at the creature with a broken femur clutched in both hands. The bone splintered against the thing's ribcage. It didn't flinch. Its talons flashed. Chen's gasp was cut short as her throat opened in a crimson arc. Alina stumbled back, her boots slipping in the gore. The slab beneath Chen's twitching body drank greedily, the scorch marks flaring brighter. The creature paused, its head cocked as if listening. The cave groaned in response, the walls trembling. For a heartbeat, Alina thought it might be enough. Then the creature stepped over Chen's body, its talons dripping. Alina's legs gave out as she scrambled backward, her fingers clawing at loose shale and crumbling bone. The creature advanced with slow, deliberate steps, each click of its talons against stone echoing like a clock ticking down. Chen's blood seeped into the slab, the scorch marks pulsing erratically, but the thing didn't stop. It watched her, its head tilting further, the vertebrae in its neck popping like knuckles. The journal, Carter's journal. Alina's hand flew to her satchel, the leather strap slick with sweat. The creature paused, its mouth unhinging slightly as if amused. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the last legible page, the ink smeared, but one phrase stood out. "The seal demands a voice." Below it, a crude sketch of a figure standing at the center of the ritual circle, arms raised. Not just blood, not just life, sound. The thing lunged. Alina rolled, its talons scoring deep furrows in the stone where her head had been. She wrenched Carter's flask from her belt, the one he'd always carried for ceremonial purposes, and smashed it against the slab. The shards glittered in the dim light, the whiskey inside pooling with Chen's blood. The creature hissed, recoiling as if struck. "Voice." Alina's voice tore from her throat, not a scream, but a chant. The syllables were clumsy at first, half-remembered from Carter's recordings, but the cave responded instantly. The walls trembled, dust sifting from the ceiling as the ochre handprints flared crimson. The creature froze mid-lunge, its talons inches from Alina's face, its too-wide mouth slack with surprise. The slab drank Chen's blood in greedy pulses, the scorch marks igniting into a lattice of light that crawled up the chamber walls. Alina's chant grew stronger, the words twisting into something older than language, something that tasted of copper and cold stone. The creature shuddered, its joints locking as if held by invisible wires. Its jaw worked soundlessly, the whispers that had poured from it moments ago now strangled in its throat. Raj's corpse twitched. Alina's stomach lurched as his fingers curled into claws, his spine arching off the ground. But the light from the slab lanced through him, pinning him like a specimen. His skin blackened, then crumbled to ash, the corruption withering under the ritual's glare. The creature screeched, a sound like nails on slate, and lunged again. But this time, its talons passed through Alina as if she were smoke. The cave exhaled. A gust of frigid air rushed from the slab, carrying with it the scent of burnt hair and damp earth. The creature's form flickered, its edges fraying like rotten cloth. Alina's voice rose, the chant now a roar that shook the stalactites overhead. The slab split with a sound like a gunshot, a fissure racing through its center. The creature's scream was cut short as the light swallowed it whole, yanking it backward into the crack like a puppet on a string. Silence. The slab sealed itself with a final, shuddering groan. The fissure vanished as if it had never been, leaving only smooth stone and the fading glow of scorch marks. Eleanor's voice gave out mid-syllable, her throat raw. The cavern was silent save for the drip of water and the ragged hitch of her own breath. Chen's body lay motionless beside the slab, her blood already drying in dark rivulets across its surface. Raj's remains were little more than a scorch mark on the stone. Eleanor's hands shook as she pressed them to the ground, the cold rock biting into her palms. The headlamp's beam flickered, casting long shadows that twitched at the edges of her vision. She forced herself to stand, legs trembling, and staggered toward the tunnel mouth. The cave exhaled again, a slow, stale breath that stirred the dust at her feet. Something crunched under her boot. Carter's journal lay splayed open, its pages warped by moisture and that same black ooze. The last entry, now fully visible, wasn't in Carter's handwriting. The letters were too precise, the ink too dark, as if the words had been burned into the paper. "It is not enough to seal them. You must forget." Eleanor's breath caught. The walls around her pulsed faintly, the ochre handprints shimmering like wet paint. A whisper brushed against her ear, not the cacophony from before, but a single voice. "Chen's. Go, now." The whisper clung to Eleanor's skin like cobwebs as she staggered toward the tunnel, the headlamp's dying beam carving a path through the gloom. Her fingers brushed the cave wall, still warm, still wrong, and came away streaked with ochre. The paint smeared under her touch, fresh as blood. Behind her the slab sat silent, its scorch marks dark. Something moved in the periphery. Eleanor didn't turn, she knew better now. The journal's warning throbbed in her skull, forget, but the cave wouldn't let her. Each step sent jagged pain through her ribs, her lungs burning with every shallow breath. The fissure ahead yawned like a throat, the narrow passage slick with moisture. She squeezed through, the rock scraping her shoulders raw. Eleanor's boots skidded on loose shale as she emerged from the tunnel, the sudden moonlight blinding after hours in the cave's belly. Her watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m., when Chen had first screamed, but dawn's violet streaks now bruised the horizon. The journal in her satchel felt heavier than stone, its pages whispering against her hip with each limping step. Eleanor's fingers closed around the journal like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. Her breath fogged in the pre-dawn air, each exhale shuddering through her battered body. The trees ahead swayed unnaturally, their shadows stretching toward her like grasping fingers. She forced herself to move, one foot in front of the other, each step sending jagged pain up her ruined knee. Eleanor didn't remember the descent. Only fragments, the way her boots slid on scree, the taste of copper in her mouth, the journal's weight pulling at her shoulder like a dying man's hand. When she woke in her own bed 3 days later, bandaged, dehydrated, with no memory of how she'd gotten there, the first thing she did was burn Carter's field notes in her bathtub. The pages curled like spider legs in the flames, releasing a stench like wet charcoal and spoiled meat. The forensic team's report arrived by email on a Tuesday morning. No remains recovered. Cave entrance collapsed. Possible landslide. Attached were photographs of the debris field, shattered limestone and fresh erosion patterns that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Eleanor deleted the file and poured herself a double whiskey, her hands steady until she noticed the postmark on the envelope beneath her mail pile. Black Ridge Co. Inside were 3 Polaroids, their chemical smell undercut by something earthier, like turned soil. The first showed Chen standing before the cave mural, her throat perfectly intact, her smile stretching ear to ear, wider than humanly possible. The second captured Raj mid-laugh, his teeth too numerous, his fingers splayed against the stone slab where he'd died. But the third photo made Eleanor's whiskey glass slip from her fingers. It showed both of them kneeling before the alcove, their hands pressed to the scorch marks in perfect mimicry of the ritual. And between them, barely visible in the shadows, stood a familiar silhouette, Hale's lanky frame, his head tilted at that impossible angle. The Polaroids developed over the next 48 hours. Alina watched from her kitchen table as Chen's irises darkened from brown to pitch black, as Raj's fingernails elongated into talons in real time. By Sunday morning, their faces had blurred at the edges, their features smearing like wet paint. She kept them locked in her desk drawer, but at night she could hear the photos whispering, not words, but the cadence of the cave's chant, the rhythm syncopated by something that sounded like chewing. On the seventh day, Alina drove to the university's archaeology lab at 3:17 a.m. The security cameras would later show her removing Carter's last artifact crate with gloved hands, though none captured the way the lock had already been pried open, the wood stained with that same black ooze. Inside, wrapped in decaying buckskin, she found what she'd feared, a stone tablet fragment bearing the seal's mirror image. The carved symbols pulsed under her flashlight beam, fresh as blood. The campus security footage showed Alina Voss leaving the archaeology lab at 3:42 a.m., the timestamp blurring as the camera glitched for exactly 17 seconds, the same duration as Chen's final scream in the cave. When the image resolved, only the artifact crate remained on the table, its lid slightly ajar, tendrils of mist curling from the gap like breath on a winter morning. 3 days later, the university archives received an unmarked delivery truck bearing Colorado plates. The night guard signed for the crate without checking the shipping label, which dissolved into black sludge the moment he touched it. Inside, nestled between moldering buckskin wrappings, was Alina's field journal, the pages warped by moisture, the ink bleeding into Rorschach blots of winged figures and screaming mouths. The final entry broke off mid-sentence. The seal isn't complete until, the rest had been clawed away, the paper fibers matted with tufts of coarse black hair. Archivist Simmons recoiled when she turned the last page. The ochre handprint was still wet, its whorls and ridges unmistakably Alina's. As Simmons watched, a single drop of paint slid down the page, pooling in the gutter of the book with a consistency too thick, too wrong. When she prodded it with a letter opener, the substance contracted like a living thing, leaving behind a faint whispering echo of Anasazi death chants. The university locked down the archives that afternoon after 2 janitors reported hearing something moving inside the crate after dark, a sound like bones rearranging themselves. By morning, the journal had vanished. Only the wrappings remained, their inner surfaces covered in fresh cave paintings that hadn't been there before, stick-figure humans fleeing a central darkness, their mouths open in silent screams. The pigments smelled of damp limestone and spoiled meat. Meanwhile, in a motel 30 miles from Black Ridge, a night clerk swore he checked in a woman matching Alina's description on the night she disappeared. She'd paid in pre-1965 silver quarters that left tarnished stains on the counter, her fingers leaving ochre smudges on the registration card. The clerk remembered 2 details with unnatural clarity. Her hiking boots were caked with a bluish clay found only in Dead Man's Creek, and when she leaned over the ledger, her shadow twisted, stretching up the wall behind her in jagged, multi-limbed silhouette before snapping back into place. Devil's Run. Did you know there's a whole section of the Blackwood Forest that isn't on any modern maps? Jake tossed the brittle, yellowed page onto the picnic table between us. The edges curled like they were trying to escape the conversation. I picked it up, careful not to tear the fragile paper. It was hand-drawn, with uneven lines marking trails and circles for campsites. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but one label stood out darker than the rest: Devil's Run. Below it, in tiny, cramped letters, someone had scribbled "Do not follow." "Where'd you even get this?" I asked, turning it over. The back was stamped with a date, 1923, and a smudged library seal from some town I'd never heard of. Jake grinned, the kind of grin that usually meant trouble. "Estate sale. Old guy had boxes of weird stuff, maps, journals, even some taxidermy. This was stuffed in a book about local folklore." He leaned in, lowering his voice even though we were the only ones in the park. Said his grandfather used to work for the Forestry Service back when they were still cleaning up the area. The others arrived then, Mia, lugging her oversized backpack like it owed her money, Darren already complaining about the heat, and Eli, quiet as always but with that sharp look in his eyes like he was calculating the risk before anyone else. We'd been hiking together since college, back when adventure meant sneaking into abandoned buildings or driving to the coast on a whim. But this felt different. The map crackled under Jake's fingers as he traced the route with a chewed-up pencil. "We start here," he said, tapping the edge of the modern park map we'd picked up from the ranger station, then dragged the pencil to where the old map's trails began, a jagged line that twisted deep into untouched forest. "Devil's Run's about 6 miles in. We camp there tonight, then push to the old ranger outpost tomorrow." Mia squinted at the overlapping maps. "That's not," she paused, tilting her head. "The contour lines don't match up. This whole section's missing on the new one." Darren snorted, because it's private now or what, they just forgot to draw it. But his laugh trailed off when Eli crouched beside him, running a thumb over the old map stains. "No," Eli said softly, "because they closed it." His voice had that tone, the one that meant he'd already dug up the history none of us wanted to hear. "There were incidents, back in the 20s, hunters, hikers. They'd find their gear, sometimes blood but never the people." Jake rolled his eyes. "Yeah, and my grandma swore her neighbor was a werewolf. Come on, it's just some overgrown trails." He stuffed the map into his pack before anyone could argue. The first few miles were easy, wide, sunlit paths that gradually narrowed until we were squeezing between mossy boulders and ducking under low branches. The air thickened, damp and sweet with decay, and the birdsong faded until the only sound was our boots crunching over dead leaves. Then, halfway up a steep incline, Mia stopped dead. "Guys." She pointed to a tree just off the trail. Carved into the bark was a symbol, 3 slashes, deep and uneven like something had scored it with claws. Eli was the first to reach out, fingertips hovering just above the gashes in the bark. "Not a bear," he muttered. His nail caught on the deepest groove, too straight, too intentional. Darren scoffed, but it lacked his usual bravado. "Some kid with a pocket knife then." Mia pulled her jacket tighter, though the air wasn't cold. "Kids don't hike this far in," she said, "and they don't carve that." The symbol wasn't alone. Further along the trail, more marks appeared, sometimes on trees, once gouged into a boulder, all leading deeper into the woods. Jake laughed it off, but even his joke sounded thin, like he was trying to convince himself. Probably just survey markers, old ones. By the time we reached Devil's Run, the sun was low, bleeding through the trees in long, red streaks. The clearing was smaller than the map suggested, the ground uneven and littered with broken branches. Something about the way they were scattered, too deliberate, like a nest or a barrier, made me step back. The fire popped, sending a spray of embers into the dark. Darren poked at it with a stick, his face flickering orange in shadow. "So," he said, too loud, "what were the odds we're being watched right now?" Mia threw a pinecone at him. "Shut up," but her eyes kept darting to the tree line. Eli hadn't spoken since we'd set up camp. He was sharpening his knife, not the little folding one he carried for apples, but the fixed blade he usually kept strapped to his pack. The whetstone hissed in steady strokes. Jake stretched, grinning like this was all some big joke. "Relax, it's just woods." But his hand kept drifting to the map crumpled in his pocket. I unrolled my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the way the branches overhead creaked. Wind, probably, or not. The symbols we'd seen weren't just marks, they were warnings, and we'd followed them straight here. The fire crackled low, its light barely pushing back the pressing dark. Shadows pooled between the trees like spilled ink, shifting whenever I blinked too long. Darren kept feeding it twigs, but they only hissed and blackened, as if the forest itself resisted burning. Mia was the first to hear it. Her head snapped up, eyes wide in the firelight. "Did you?" A branch snapped somewhere beyond the clearing. Not the lazy pop of dry wood, but the sharp, wet crack of something heavy stepping wrong. Eli's knife stilled. Jake laughed, but it came out strangled, probably a deer. Another sound, closer this time, a rustling that moved against the wind. The hairs on my neck prickled. Animals didn't walk like that. They didn't stop like that either, pausing just beyond sight like they were listening to us breathe. Eli stood slowly, the knife in his hand catching the firelight in a thin, liquid gleam. His free hand motioned for silence, a gesture so sharp it cut through Darren's next joke before it could leave his mouth. The woods had gone utterly still, the way they do when something predatory is near. Even the insects had stopped humming. Darren's breath fogged in the sudden chill as he mouthed "what the fuck" at me. The firelight flickered, casting long, skeletal shadows that twitched unnaturally against the trees. Then, silence. Even the wind had died. My fingers curled around the cold metal of my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. We must have dozed off at some point, not slept, not really, but that shallow, half-aware state where every snap of a twig jerks you back to full alertness. When dawn finally seeped through the trees, gray and damp, it felt like we'd survived something. Jake was already up, poking at the cold fire pit with a stick. "See," he said, too loud. "Nothing but—" His voice cut off as he turned toward the tree line. The stick fell from his fingers. Jake didn't move. His breath fogged in the morning chill, his shoulders rigid. The rest of us followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing, just the usual tangle of undergrowth and tree trunks. Then Mia made a choked sound and my brain finally registered what was wrong. The symbols, dozens of them, carved into every visible tree surrounding the clearing. But we hadn't seen them last night. They hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. Eli was already moving, knife out, his boots silent on the damp earth. He stopped at the nearest tree, running his thumb over the fresh gashes. The bark was still weeping sap. "These weren't here yesterday," he said quietly. Darren let out a shaky laugh. "Okay, ha ha, who's the asshole sneaking around carving trees in the dark?" But his hands were trembling as he zipped his jacket up to his chin. Eli didn't answer Darren. He just kept staring at the symbols, his fingers tracing the grooves like he was reading Braille. The rest of us huddled closer together without meaning to, our shoulders brushing. The morning air smelled wrong, not like pine and damp earth, but something sour beneath it, like meat left in the sun too long. Mia was the first to say what we were all thinking. We should turn back. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white around her water bottle. Jake scoffed, but it sounded forced. "Turn back, over some scratches on trees." He yanked the old map from his pocket, unfolding it with too much force. A corner tore off in his fingers. "We're halfway to the outpost. It's just—" Jake stuffed the map back into his pocket with a sharp jerk of his wrist. "We're not turning back over some fucking tree carvings," he said, louder than necessary. The words hung in the air like a challenge to us, to the woods, to whatever had made those marks. He shouldered his pack and marched forward without waiting for agreement, his boots crushing ferns underfoot with unnecessary force. The trail narrowed further, the trees pressing in from both sides like spectators at a funeral. At first the changes were subtle. A branch bent at an angle too sharp for wind or weight, a root coiled around a rock like a noose. Then Darren tripped over something and cursed, kicking at the ground. What the hell? The root he'd stumbled on wasn't just gnarled. It looped back on itself in a perfect knot, the wood still raw where it had twisted against its own grain. Mia stopped dead, her hand flying out to grip my arm. "Look up," she whispered. The canopy above us wasn't just dense, it was woven, branches interlaced in a lattice so precise it couldn't have been natural. Sunlight filtered through in jagged strips, painting the path with distorted shadows that twitched even though there was no wind. Eli's knife was out again, his thumb testing the edge absently as he scanned the trees. Jake forged ahead, but his steps had lost their confidence. "It's just," he faltered, staring at a birch ahead. Its trunk was split down the middle, the two halves peeled back like ribs around a hollow core. Inside, something glistened wetly in the dim light. Darren made a retching sound and turned away, but not before we all saw it. The carcass of a deer, wedged into the tree's cavity like it had been pressed there, its antlers snapped off and arranged in a spiral at its hooves. A sound ripped through the silence, not an animal cry but something closer to laughter, if laughter could be made of splintering bone and tearing sinew. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing between the trees until Darren clapped his hands over his ears. "We need to go back," he gasped, but Jake was already shaking his head, his face pale under the grime. Eli grabbed Jake's shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to make him flinch. "You seeing this?" He jerked his chin toward the hollowed-out tree. The deer's ribs were cracked outward, not snapped by force but pushed from the inside. The stench hit us then, thick and metallic, like old blood left to congeal in a sealed room. Mia gagged, stumbling back into me. Darren's voice cracked. That's fresh." He wasn't wrong. The blood pooling at the base of the tree was still glossy, black in the weak light. Something had done this recently, maybe minutes ago, maybe while we'd stood here arguing. Jake swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. Okay, we'll—" A branch snapped behind us, sharp as a gunshot. We spun as one, Eli's knife flashing up. Nothing moved. The undergrowth was still, the trees silent. Too silent. No birds, no insects, just the wet, rhythmic drip of blood hitting leaves. Then the wind shifted. The wind carried the scent first, copper and rot, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. Darren dry heaved, doubling over, and Mia's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain. Eli didn't move, didn't breathe, his knife held so still it might as well have been part of him. Jake took a step back, his boot crunching on a brittle branch. The sound was obscenely loud. Something answered it. Not from the trees, not from the ground, but from everywhere, a wet, clicking vibration that hummed through the air like a saw blade dragged across bone. The deer carcass in the birch tree shuddered, its ruptured ribs trembling as if something inside still stirred. Mia's breath hitched. "We run now," she whispered. We ran. The forest blurred past us, branches whipping at our arms and faces as we crashed through the undergrowth. Jake led the way, his pack bouncing wildly as he hurdled a fallen log. Eli was right behind him, knife still in hand, his breaths coming in sharp, controlled bursts. Darren's foot caught on a root. He went down hard, skidding on his palms, and I barely had time to yank him up before Mia barreled into us both. "Where the fuck are we going?" Darren panted, his voice raw. Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the map clutched in his shaking hands, the paper smeared with dirt and sweat. The trails on it didn't match the terrain anymore. The trees were too close, the ground too uneven. We were off course, and we all knew it. Eli snatched the map from Jake, his eyes darting over the faded lines. "Here," he muttered, jabbing a finger at a thin, dashed line, "a creek maybe, or a dry wash. If we hit water, we follow it downstream. It'll lead out." He didn't say if we make it that far. He didn't have to. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the ragged symphony of our breathing and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere behind us. Not close, not yet, but keeping pace. The map crumpled in Eli's grip as he took point, his knife glinting like a shard of ice in the dappled light. We moved in a tight pack, shoulders brushing, our breath sinking into a ragged rhythm. Every few steps, Mia would glance back, her pupils dilated black with adrenaline. I didn't need to turn around to know what she was listening for, the slow, deliberate crunch of something moving just out of sight, matching our pace without ever quite catching up. The creek appeared suddenly, a silver thread cutting through the undergrowth. Eli crouched at its edge, fingers skimming the water. "This way," he said, voice low. The current was weak, the stream bed choked with dead leaves, but it was something to follow. Jake hesitated, his hand hovering over the map still clutched in Eli's other hand. "That's not," he started, but Darren shoved past him, splashing into the shallow water with a grunt. We followed the creek downstream, our boots slipping on moss-slick rocks. The trees grew denser, their trunks knotted with vines that hung like nooses. Once, I swore I saw one twitch, curling tighter around a branch as we passed. Mia gasped, gripping my arm. Ahead, the water darkened around a bend, swirling around something half-submerged. Eli waded forward, knife raised, and kicked at it. A deer skull rolled free, its antlers tangled in a nest of roots. The eye sockets stared up at us, filled not with water but with clotted earth and writhing beetles. Jake made a sound like a punched lung. "That's impossible," he whispered. "We're miles from." The deer skull rocked in the current, its hollow gaze tracking us as we waded past. Eli didn't pause, just stepped over it, his knife glinting in the murky light filtering through the canopy. The creek bank steepened, forcing us into single file, the water rising to our knees. Something brushed against my calf, slick and fibrous like rotting rope, and I jerked away, nearly losing my balance. Mia caught my elbow, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a rocky outcrop where the creek widened into a shallow pool. Eli held up a fist, signaling us to stop. The water here was unnaturally still, its surface coated with an iridescent film that shimmered like gasoline. Darren gagged, covering his nose. "What is that?" Eli crouched, dipping a finger into the pool. It came away streaked with something dark and viscous. "Blood," he murmured. "Old blood." Jake scoffed, but his voice wavered. "Bullshit. That much blood would mean." Eli wiped his finger on a rock, leaving a rusty smear. "Means something bled here," he said flatly. "A lot." The words hung in the air like the stench of the pool, thick, cloying, impossible to ignore. Mia's hand tightened around my wrist, her nails biting into my skin. The pool wasn't the end of it. The rocks around its edges were wrong, not mossy or worn smooth by water, but jagged as if something had chewed them into shape. One boulder bore deep, parallel gouges, the stone beneath the scratches a raw, lighter gray, fresh. Jake traced one with a shaking finger, then recoiled. "Claws," he muttered. "Big ones." A sound cut through the silence, not the clicking from before, but a low, shuddering inhale like something drawing breath through a punctured lung. It came from above us. We froze. The canopy rustled, branches creaking under unseen weight. Darren didn't scream. He didn't have time. One moment he was standing beside me, his mouth open mid-protest. The next, a shadow dropped from the trees too fast, too wrong, and Darren was gone. Just gone. The air where he'd stood shimmered with displaced moisture, his half-shouted syllables still echoing. A single hiking boot landed in the pool with a wet plop, spinning lazily in the bloody water. The scream tore through the trees before Darren's boot even settled in the water. It didn't sound human, not anymore. Just a wet, unraveling shriek that cut off with a pop like a joint dislocating. Mia's fingers clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide enough to show white all around. Eli's knife jerked upward, but there was nothing to stab. Just the swaying branches overhead, the leaves trembling as if something enormous had just vaulted through them. Jake made a noise like a wounded animal and lunged for the pool, scrambling toward Darren's boot like it might still contain his foot. "We have to," his voice cracked. The boot was empty. The laces were still tied. Eli grabbed Jake's pack strap and yanked him backward. "Run," he hissed. "Now." We ran like something unhitched from gravity, our feet barely touching the ground. Branches lashed at our arms, roots snaked up to trip us, but we didn't stop. Couldn't. Behind us, the trees groaned under the weight of something moving too fast to see. A flicker of grayish skin stretched over jutting bone, the snick of claws parting bark. Mia sobbed as she ran, her breath coming in jagged hitches. I didn't dare look back. The creek bank gave way to a steep slope, and we half fell, half slid down it, our backs scraping against jagged rocks. Eli hit the bottom first, rolling to his feet with the knife still clutched in his fist. Jake landed hard beside him, his face streaked with mud and something darker, blood from a gash above his eyebrow. Mia collapsed against me, her chest heaving. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing and the distant drip of water. Then silence, too complete. Even the insects had gone quiet. Eli crouched, pressing his palm to the ground. "It's following," he whispered. His fingers traced a faint vibration in the earth, something too rhythmic to be natural. Thump, thump, like a heartbeat or footsteps. Jake wiped his face with a shaking hand. We can't outrun it. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual bravado. Eli's grip tightened on his knife, his knuckles bleaching white. Then we don't run. His voice was a blade, sharp, cold, and final. The creek water lapped at our boots, tinged pink from Darren's, from the pool. Mia's fingers dug into my forearm, her nails drawing blood, but the pain was distant, irrelevant. The trees above us creaked. Not from wind, there wasn't any, from weight. Something was perched up there, watching, calculating. Jake's breath fogged in the unnatural chill as he fumbled for his multi-tool, hands shaking too badly to open the blade. "Fuck," he whispered. "Fuck, fuck." A branch snapped, directly overhead. Mia screamed. Eli moved like lightning, shoving us aside as something dropped into the space we just occupied. The impact sent mud and creek water spraying upward, obscuring it for a heartbeat. Then the water cleared, and I wished it hadn't. It was tall, too tall. 7 feet at least, its limbs stretched grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. The skin, if it could be called skin, was gray and tight, stretched over a skeletal frame like melted wax poured over a corpse. The face. God, the face. Sunken eyes, black and depthless, set too high above a mouth that split the skull vertically, rows of needle teeth glistening with something thick and dark. It didn't breathe. It pulsed, the ribs expanding and collapsing with a wet, clicking sound. The creature cocked its head, too far, too wrong, like a bird considering prey. Eli lunged, knife flashing. The blade sank into its ribs with a wet thunk, buried to the hilt. The thing didn't flinch. It smiled, that vertical maw peeling open wider, and exhaled, a gust of air so putrid it made my eyes water. Eli tried to wrench the knife free. It didn't budge. The creature's hand, all knuckles and elongated fingers, closed around his wrist. The crack of bone was louder than Mia's scream. Jake moved before I could, swinging his pack like a battering ram. The impact should have staggered it. Instead, the creature absorbed the blow, its torso denting inward like rotten wood before snapping back into shape. Jake stumbled, off balance, and the thing moved, a blur of gray limbs, and then Jake was airborne, hurled into the creek with a splash that sent water arcing 10 feet high. Mia grabbed my arm, nails drawing blood. "Run, asterisk," she hissed, but my feet were rooted. Eli was still standing there, cradling his shattered wrist, staring at the thing with a kind of detached fascination. The creature tilted its head again, and this time it spoke. The sound wasn't speech, not really. It was the wet pop of a joint dislocating, the scrape of bone on bone, twisted into something that approximated words. "Y-O-U-S-T-A-Y," each syllable dripped like syrup from its jagged maw. Eli didn't flinch. His face was eerily calm, his breath steady despite the way his wrist bent at a nauseating angle. Mia's grip on my arm tightened. "We have to," her whisper died as the creature's head swiveled toward us, those black pits locking onto her face. It smiled wider, teeth glistening with strands of something too thick to be saliva. Jake surfaced from the creek with a gasp, his nose bleeding, his eyes wild. He took one look at the creature and froze, not out of fear but calculation. His hand dipped into the water, fingers closing around a jagged rock. The creature didn't notice. Its attention was fixed on Eli, who stood motionless, his good hand flexing as if preparing to grab something. Then Eli spat in its face. The creature recoiled, not from pain but from surprise. Eli's saliva sizzled against its gray flesh like acid, etching a smoking trail down its sunken cheek. Its vertical mouth gaped wider, emitting a sound like splintering ice, and in that split second of distraction Eli moved. His good hand flashed to his belt, yanking free a rusted flask I hadn't seen him stash there. He thumbed the cap off with his teeth and flung the contents, a dark, viscous liquid, straight into the thing's gaping maw. The creature shrieked. Not the clicking, bone-grinding noise from before, but a full-throated howl that sent birds exploding from distant trees. Its limbs spasmed, joints popping grotesquely as it staggered back, clawing at its own face. The stench hit us then, burnt hair and rotting meat, thick enough to taste. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged from the creek, rock raised high, and brought it down on the creature's knee with a wet crunch. The thing didn't fall. It folded, its torso bending double like a snapped ruler, and its clawed hand lashed out. Jake barely dodged, the talons shredding his sleeve instead of his throat. Mia yanked me backward as Eli stumbled toward us, his face gray with pain. "Salt and iron filings," he gasped, clutching his ruined wrist. "Granddad's journal said it hated." The creature convulsed, its ribs heaving, and vomited a black, tar-like substance onto the rocks. The liquid hissed where it landed, eating into the stone like acid. The creature reeled, its elongated limbs twitching in unnatural jerks as black bile dribbled from its gaping maw. Eli's knife, still embedded in its ribs, wobbled with each convulsion, the blade slick with that same tar-like ooze. Jake scrambled backward, his fingers digging into the creek bed for another rock, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. Mia didn't wait. She grabbed my wrist and hauled me toward the densest part of the undergrowth, her voice a hiss in my ear. "Move now," Eli followed, cradling his shattered wrist against his chest, his face bone-white but his eyes sharp. Behind us, the creature's shrieks escalated into something that wasn't sound so much as pressure, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. We crashed through the brush, branches whipping at our faces, roots snagging our ankles. The map was gone, lost in the creek or shredded in Jake's pack, but Eli led with the certainty of someone who'd memorized every twisted mile. "There," he panted, jerking his chin toward a granite outcrop ahead. "Cave, small. Go." Jake reached it first, sliding into the narrow crevice with a grunt. Mia shoved me in after him, the rock scraping my shoulders raw. Eli squeezed in last, his back pressed to the stone, his good hand braced against the wall as if he could hold the entire forest at bay. Outside, the creature's footsteps crunched closer, slow and deliberate, the rhythm all wrong, too many steps, too few limbs. The cave was barely wide enough for us to stand shoulder to shoulder, the ceiling so low Jake had to crouch. Eli pressed his ruined wrist against his ribs, his breathing controlled but shallow, the kind of quiet that meant he was biting back pain. Outside, the footsteps paused. Something sniffed the air, a wet, guttural sound that made Mia flinch against me. Jake's fingers found mine in the dark, his palms slick with creek water and blood. He squeezed once hard. "Don't move." The creature's shadow passed the cave mouth, long, distorted, its limbs bending at angles that made my stomach twist. It stopped, turned. Those black pits where eyes should have been stared straight into the crevice. Mia's breath hitched. The creature smiled, its vertical maw peeling open to reveal rows of needle teeth glistening with Eli's blackened spit. Then, impossibly, it stepped back, not in retreat, like it was waiting. Eli's voice was a thread of sound. "It knows we're here." The cave's stale air clung to my throat as the creature's silhouette lingered at the entrance, its elongated fingers flexing against the rock. Jake's grip on my hand turned vice-like, his pulse thudding against my palm like a trapped bird. Mia pressed into my side, her breath shallow, her jacket sleeve still damp from the creek where Darren had *No, don't think about that." Eli shifted minutely beside me, his shattered wrist cradled against his ribs. His good hand dipped into his pocket, fingers emerging with a handful of coarse, gray granules. "Salt." He mouthed a single word at us. "Doorway." The creature's head tilted, the motion grotesquely fluid, as if its spine were made of wet leather. A low, rattling exhale seeped from its maw, carrying the stench of rotted meat left to bloat in the sun. It took a step forward, then jerked back with a hiss as Eli flicked the salt into the threshold. The granules sizzled where they landed, etching tiny black pits into the stone. The creature recoiled, its limbs twitching in erratic spasms. For a heartbeat, it seemed to waver, its form blurring at the edges like smoke. Then it laughed, a sound like bones grinding in a mortar, and vanished into the trees with a rustle too deliberate to be retreat. Eli slumped against the cave wall, his breath escaping in a shuddering rush. "Salt weakens it," he muttered, more to himself than us. "But not enough." His fingers trembled as he dug into his pocket again, producing a small leather pouch tied with twine. Inside, iron filings glittered dully in the dim light. Jake wiped his bloody nose with the back of his hand. "You've been carrying that this whole time." His voice cracked between accusation and awe. Eli didn't answer. He was staring at the cave's back wall where a narrow fissure snaked upward into darkness. "There's a way out," he said abruptly. "Old Miner's Shaft leads to the ridge." His certainty was unsettling, like he'd known this cave existed before we'd stumbled into it. Mia edged toward the fissure, her flashlight beam wavering. The rock was streaked with rusty veins, the air smelling of damp metal and something sharper, ozone maybe. "How do you know that?" she whispered. Eli's fingers traced the fissure's edge, his voice hollow. "Granddad's journals, he mapped these caves." The unspoken after he escaped hung between us. The flashlight beam caught something embedded in the rock, a rusted nail, bent at a cruel angle, its tip dark with old stains. Jake exhaled sharply. "So we crawl through some death tunnel and what? It's just waiting on the other side." His knuckles were white around the rock he'd grabbed from the creek. The creature's shriek echoed outside, distant but closing fast, a sound like tree roots being ripped from wet earth. Eli didn't flinch. He pried the nail free with a grunt, the metal squealing. "Iron," he said, pressing it into Mia's palm. Her fingers closed around it instinctively, the tip glinting. "It hates iron almost as much as salt." The fissure exhaled a damp, metallic breath against my face as I wedged myself in first. The walls pressed tight enough to scrape my ribs raw, the ceiling dripping something viscous that wasn't water. Behind me, Mia's breathing hitched as the tunnel angled sharply upward. Eli's voice floated from the rear, strained but steady. "Keep moving. Don't look back." The fissure narrowed abruptly, forcing me to turn sideways, my ribs grinding against jagged rock. Something warm trickled down my temple, blood or sweat. I couldn't tell. Behind me, Mia's flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that writhed like the thing outside. The air thickened with the scent of wet iron and something older, like turned earth after a grave's been disturbed. Ahead the tunnel branched. Eli's voice rasped from the dark. "Left, always left." His certainty was unsettling. Jake's breath hitched. "Why left?" But Eli didn't answer. The right fork exhaled a draft that smelled wrong, like meat left to spoil in a sealed jar. Mia's hand gripped my ankle. Her fingers were ice. "Did you hear that?" A wet, rhythmic drip echoed from the right tunnel, too slow for water, too thick. I didn't answer. My throat locked around the image of Darren's boots spinning in crimson water. We crawled. The left tunnel sloped upward, the ceiling so low my spine screamed. Jake's grunts turned to whimpers as his injured ribs scraped rock. Then light, faint gray slicing through a hairline crack ahead. Eli hissed, quiet, but it was too late. The crack widened just enough to reveal a sliver of daylight, and the silhouette standing directly in front of it. Not the creature, something worse. Mia gasped, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam rolled, illuminating a pair of mud-caked boots, the laces neatly tied. Darren's boots. The figure stepped forward and the light crawled up his legs, except they weren't legs anymore. They bent backward at the knee, the skin stretched taut over too many joints, the fabric of his hiking pants split at the seams. His voice, when it came, was Darren's, but layered with something wet and clicking underneath. "You left me," he said, and his jaw unhinged vertically like a snake S, the lower half dropping to his sternum. Eli lunged past me, his iron nail flashing. It sank into Darren's, into the thing's throat with a sound like puncturing rotten fruit. Black ichor bubbled from the wound, but the creature wearing Darren's skin just smiled wider, its teeth elongating into needles. "Salt and iron," it mocked in Darren's tone, plucking the nail free like a splinter. "Did you really think?" Eli's breath hitched as the creature twisted Darren's face into a smile that split too wide, the jawbone creaking audibly. The iron nail clattered to the ground, its tip blackened and smoking. I shoved Mia backward into the tunnel just as the thing lunged, its elongated fingers snagging Eli's jacket sleeve. Fabric tore with a sound like ripping meat. Jake moved faster than I'd ever seen him, snatching up Mia's fallen flashlight and driving it straight into the thing's exposed throat. The beam flickered wildly as glass shattered, but the creature barely flinched. Its free hand whipped around, catching Jake across the temple with a crack that sent him sprawling into the fissure wall. Blood sheeted down his face, bright and arterial. Mia screamed, not in fear, in fury. She launched herself forward with Darren's rusted nail raised like a dagger. The creature turned its grinning maw toward her, but Mia didn't hesitate. She drove the nail straight into its left eye socket with a wet crunch. Black fluid geysered, spraying across the tunnel walls as the thing reeled backward with a shriek that vibrated the rocks around us. Eli seized the moment. His good hand flashed to his waist, yanking free a coil of thin wire I hadn't noticed before, piano wire, glinting silver in the dim light. He looped it around the creature's thrashing neck and pulled. The wire bit deep, smoking where it touched flesh. The stench of burning hair filled the tunnel. The creature's scream cut off with a wet gurgle as Eli's wire sawed deeper, its thrashing limbs knocking loose rocks from the tunnel ceiling. Mia wrenched the nail free and stabbed again, this time into the gaping vertical maw. The thing's jaw snapped shut reflexively, teeth shearing through its own blackened tongue. Jake, half blind with blood, crawled forward and drove his boot into its backward bent knee. The joint popped with a sound like a green branch snapping. For one suspended second, the thing that wore Darren's face froze. Then its skin split, not along the seams but vertically, peeling open like overripe fruit to reveal the gray, skeletal horror beneath. Eli yanked the wire taut. The creature's head lolled grotesquely, still attached by threads of tendon, its true form now fully exposed, the stretched skin of Darren's face hanging from its skull like a discarded mask. "Go," Eli roared, his voice raw. The tunnel ahead yawned open into dim light. Mia didn't hesitate. She grabbed my wrist and hauled me past the twitching creature, our boots slipping in the black ichor pooling beneath it. Jake staggered after us, one hand pressed to his temple, his blood leaving dark spatters on the rock. Eli backed toward the exit, the wire still taut in his fists, his shattered wrist bent at that impossible angle. The creature's limbs spasmed once, twice, then went still. Its hollow eye sockets tracked us even as its body crumpled, the wire finally severing its head with a wet snick. The head rolled toward Eli's feet, mouth still working silently. He kicked it aside with a snarl and turned to run. Eli's boot sent the creature's head spinning into the tunnel wall with a wet thunk. It came to rest facing us, Darren's features sloughing off like melted wax, revealing the gray, skeletal horror beneath. The jaw unhinged once more, a final, silent scream, before the black ooze pooled thickly around it, eating into the rock like acid. We didn't wait. Mia dragged me forward by the wrist, her fingernails digging crescents into my skin. The tunnel narrowed abruptly, the ceiling dipping so low we had to crawl on our hands and knees, the jagged rocks scraping our palms raw. Jake brought up the rear, his breath ragged and wet, his temples still gushing blood. The air shifted damp and metallic but fresher. The fissure ahead glowed faintly with daylight. Eli reached it first, wedging his shoulders through the narrow gap. For one heart-stopping moment, he stuck fast, the rock biting into his ribs. Then, with a grunt, he forced himself through, disappearing into the light. Mia followed, her jacket tearing on a protruding edge. I squeezed through after her, the rock scraping my back like a cheese grater. The sudden brightness blinded me. I stumbled forward, and my boot met empty air. The drop wasn't far, maybe 6 feet, but the impact drove the air from my lungs as I landed in a shallow stream. Cold water surged over my knees, shocking me back into my body. Above, Mia's silhouette blocked the sunlight as she hesitated at the fissures edge. "Jump!" I croaked, scrambling upright. She leapt, colliding with me in a tangle of limbs and icy spray. Eli was already moving upstream, his ruined wrist cradled against his ribs, his good hand gripping Jake's elbow as the bigger man stumbled. Blood sheeted down Jake's face from the gash at his temple, turning the water pink around his boots. The stream cut through a narrow gorge, its walls too steep to climb, the current tugging insistently at our ankles. "This way," Eli panted, pointing to where the gorge widened ahead. "It can't follow running water." Behind us, the fissure exhaled a wet clicking noise, like knuckles cracking underwater. Mia didn't look back. She grabbed my hand and ran, our boots skidding on moss-slick rocks. The stream curved sharply, revealing a downed pine spanning the gorge like a bridge. Eli vaulted onto it without breaking stride, his balance unnaturally sure for a man with a shattered wrist. Jake followed, his movements sluggish, his blood-smeared face pale as wax. The tree groaned under our combined weight, its bark peeling away in damp strips. Halfway across, a branch snapped under Mia's foot, and the creature's head erupted from the fissure behind us, its jaw unhinging with a pop that echoed off the gorge walls. It didn't have a body, just a spine trailing black viscera like a grotesque tail, its elongated fingers clawing at the rock as it pulled itself forward. "Don't stop," Eli barked, shoving Jake toward the far bank. The tree trembled as the creature surged onto it, moving like a broken puppet, its vertebrae snapping audibly with each lurch. Mia reached the other side first, hauling herself onto solid ground just as the creature's fingers brushed my backpack. I twisted away, feeling fabric tear. Then Jake's hand closed around my forearm, yanking me onto the bank with a force that left my shoulder screaming. The moment my knees hit the bank, Eli was already moving, snatching up a fallen branch thick as his wrist and swinging it like a bat. The wood connected with the creature's skull with a crack that sent teeth skittering into the stream. Black fluid arced through the air, sizzling where it hit the water. The head reeled backward, its spine coiling like a wounded snake, but didn't fall. It laughed, a sound like ice splitting underfoot. Jake collapsed beside me, his breath coming in wet, ragged gulps. Blood matted his eyelashes into clumps. "Fuck," he wheezed, pawing at his temple. "Think it." His words dissolved into a cough that speckled his chin with red. Mia grabbed my shoulder, her fingers trembling. "We have to go." Her voice was raw, stripped down to the bone. Beyond her, Eli stood braced between us and the creature, his branch raised like a sword. The thing's hollow eyes locked onto him, its jaw working soundlessly. Then, with a wet pop, it disengaged its spine from the tree and slid into the water, the current carrying it downstream in a swirl of black tendrils. Eli did lower the branch. "It's not dead," he said quietly. His wrist hung at that unnatural angle, the bones clearly visible through torn skin. "It's learning." The gorge ahead widened into a sunlit valley, the stream flattening into a shallow river. No signs marked the way, no trails, no blazes on the trees. Just an expanse of ferns and birch trees too evenly spaced to be natural. Jake staggered upright, using my arm as a crutch. "Which way?" he mumbled. His pupils were uneven, one blown wide, the other a pinprick. Eli's gaze flickered toward the tree line, his jaw tightening. "West," he said hoarsely, "against the river." The words carried the weight of something remembered, an old warning maybe, a survivor's instinct. Mia hesitated, her fingers tightening around Darren's rusted nail. "The ranger station's east," she whispered. Eli didn't look at her. "It knows that too." We staggered westward, the river's murmur fading behind us. Jake leaned heavier with each step, his breath bubbling wetly. The forest here was different, older. The birch trunks bore faint carvings, symbols worn smooth by time but unmistakably the same as those near Devil's Run. Something crunched underfoot. Mia's flashlight beam revealed a scatter of bones, deer, maybe, arranged in a perfect circle. At its center sat Darren's water bottle, the cap screwed tight, condensation still beating the plastic. The bottle gleamed in the fading light like a cruel joke. Mia made a sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a sob, and kicked it. It rolled into the bone circle, bouncing off a cracked femur with a hollow clack. Eli grabbed her wrist before she could stomp after it. "Don't touch anything," he hissed. His fingers left smears of black ichor on her skin. Jake swayed, blinking hard like he was trying to clear his vision. "It's hurting us," he slurred. Blood trickled from his nose again, thick and slow as syrup. "Like fucking cattle." The trees rustled despite the windless air. Eli's head snapped up, his good hand flexing around the branch he still carried. Shadows pooled between the birches, too deep for the time of day. Mia's flashlight beam skittered across them, revealing nothing, then flickered and died. "Batteries were brand new," she whispered. The silence after Mia's flashlight died was absolute. No wind, no birds, just the slow drip of Jake's blood hitting the leaf litter. Eli's breath fogged in the sudden cold as he stepped forward, the branch trembling in his grip. "Stay close," he murmured. His voice was frayed at the edges like a rope about to snap. Something shifted in the shadows, a flicker of movement too quick to track. The trees groaned, their trunks bending subtly inward, forming a corridor that led deeper into the forest. The carvings on their bark pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Mia grabbed my sleeve. "It's not just hurting us," she whispered. Her nails dug through the fabric. "It's changing the woods." Jake coughed wetly, spitting a wad of crimson onto the moss. His good eye rolled toward Eli. "Got another miracle in that pocket of yours." Eli's fingers twitched toward his pocket again, but his hand came up empty. The branch in his grip splintered as his knuckles whitened. "Run," he said, not a command but a resignation. Eli's word hung in the air like a death sentence. The trees leaned closer, their branches knitting together overhead into a latticework that blotted out the sky. Jake swayed on his feet, one hand pressed to his ruined temple. The blood between his fingers wasn't red anymore. It was blackening at the edges, thick as motor oil. Mia moved first. She grabbed Jake's arm and hauled him forward with a strength that shouldn't have been in her wiry frame. His boots dragged twin grooves through the moss as we staggered after them. The forest resisted. Roots snaked up to catch our ankles. Branches dipped low to rake at our faces. Something chuckled from the shadows, a wet, clicking sound that wasn't Darren's voice anymore. It was becoming something else. Eli brought up the rear, his branch raised like a torch. The wood was smoking where it had touched the creature's blood. "Left," he gasped as the path forked. "Always left." The right fork exhaled a breath that smelled of opened graves. Jake collapsed 30 paces later. His knees hit the soft earth with a thud, his breathing ragged as a torn curtain. Mia knelt beside him, her hands fluttering over his face. The wound at his temple pulsed grotesquely, veins spidering outward in inky black tendrils. "It's in him," she whispered. Her voice broke on the last word. Eli didn't respond. He was staring at something beyond us, his face slack with a horror I couldn't bear to turn and see. The chuckle came again, closer this time, followed by the wet snap of tendon stretching. Jake's fingers twitched against the moss, his nails gouging deep furrows as his back arched unnaturally. The black veins pulsed beneath his skin, branching like lightning across his face. Mia recoiled as his jaw unhinged with a wet pop, just a fraction wider than humanly possible. Eli moved before I could blink. He drove the smoking branch straight into Jake's chest with a crunch of ribs. Jake, or what was left of him, screeched, a sound that wasn't his own, writhing against the wood impaling him. Black fluid geysered from his mouth, splattering the birch trunks. The symbols on the bark hissed where it landed. Mia screamed, not for Jake, for the thing slithering out of his gaping maw, a segmented, centipede-like horror made of cartilage and glistening tendons. It hit the ground twisting, its needle teeth gnashing toward Eli's boot. He stomped down hard. The creature burst like a rotten grape, spraying ichor that ate through moss down to bare stone. Jake's body went limp, his eyes still his own, somehow locked onto mine. His lips moved soundlessly, Run. Then the black veins contracted violently and his skull imploded with a sound like a melon dropped from a height. The silence after Jake's skull collapsed in on itself was worse than the sound. Mia made a noise like a wounded animal, her hands hovering over the ruin of his face like she could somehow piece him back together. Eli grabbed her shoulder and yanked her backward just as the ground beneath Jake's body breathed, a slow, deliberate contraction that sucked his remains into the earth like quicksand. Mia stumbled, her boots sliding in the wet mulch. Eli's grip on her arm was the only thing keeping her upright. His face was bloodless, his lips peeled back from his teeth in a rictus of pain and fury. "Don't look," he rasped, but it was too late. The forest was moving now, the birch trunks pulsing with that same slow rhythm, the carvings on their bark weeping thin streams of black fluid. The chuckle came again, closer, hungrier from directly above us. Mia's head snapped up. The branches overhead were knitting together, forming a grotesque canopy of intertwined limbs, some too thin and jointed to be tree growth. A single, elongated finger uncurled from the mass, its nail blackened and cracked and pointed westward. Eli didn't hesitate. He dragged Mia into motion, his shattered wrist dangling uselessly at his side. I followed, my lungs burning with the effort of not screaming. The forest resisted us at first, the undergrowth tangling around our ankles like living things, but as we neared the edge of the birch grove, the trees abruptly stilled. The air smelled of ozone and wet iron, sharp enough to make my eyes water. Ahead, the ground dropped away into a ravine so steep it might as well have been a cliff. At its base, a narrow creek glinted in the fading light, its waters rushing over smooth stones. Eli skidded to a halt at the edge, his boots sending pebbles skittering into the void. "Down," he gasped. "Now." Mia didn't hesitate. She launched herself over the edge in a controlled slide, her jacket tearing on jagged rock as she skidded down the ravine. Eli shoved me after her, his palms slick with blood. Before following, his shattered wrist cradled against his ribs like a broken wing. The descent was a blur of scraping flesh and dislodged shale, the world tilting violently until my boots hit the creek bed with a jolt that sent white pain up my spine. The water was colder than I expected, shockingly alive against my skin. Mia was already waist-deep, her hands braced against the current, her face turned upstream like she expected to see Jake's corpse floating toward us. Eli wrenched my arm, dragging me into the center flow where the water ran fastest. "It can't cross moving water," he panted, but his eyes darted to the ravine's edge, where the trees leaned over like spectators to an execution. Something moved in the shadows above, a flicker of too many limbs, the wet gleam of teeth in the dying light. The chuckle came again, vibrating through the rocks beneath our feet. The creek's surface rippled unnaturally, forming perfect concentric circles as if something heavy had dropped in upstream. Mia's breath hitched. "It's testing the water." Eli's fingers dug into my forearm. "Run." The creek's current tugged at our legs like a living thing as we staggered downstream, our boots slipping on moss-slick stones. Eli surged ahead, his shattered wrist held stiffly against his ribs, his good hand dragging Mia by the elbow. The ravine walls loomed higher with each step, the last of the daylight reduced to a thin gray ribbon overhead. Behind us, the water changed. Not a ripple, a distortion, as if the surface tension had inverted. Mia gasped as the creek bed beneath us pulsed once, hard enough to send me to my knees. The cold water closed over my shoulders, filling my mouth with the taste of rust and something older, like coins left in a corpse's palm. Eli yanked me upright just as the current twisted. The water upstream wasn't flowing toward us anymore. It was recoiling, pulling back in a way that defied gravity, exposing wet stones furrowed with deep, parallel grooves. Claw marks, fresh ones. Mia's hand clamped over her mouth. The retreating water left behind a streambed littered with bones, some old and weathered, others still glistening with shreds of flesh. A deer skull rocked gently in the eddy where the water still pooled, its antlers tangled with a familiar red bandana. Darren's. The chuckle came again, but this time it was underwater, a guttural, bubbling sound that made the remaining puddles vibrate. Eli didn't hesitate. He shoved us toward the opposite bank where the ravine wall dipped low enough to climb. Out. Now. The bank crumbled under my fingers like wet cake, the dirt blackened and reeking of turned earth. Mia scrambled up first, her nails tearing grooves in the mud as she hauled herself over the edge. I followed, my boots sliding against the loose soil. Then Eli's hand clamped around my ankle, his grip desperate. "Pull," he barked, his voice raw. My fingers dug into the mud as Mia hauled me upward, her breath ragged in my ear. Eli's grip on my ankle slipped, just for a second, but that second was enough. The creek bed beneath him erupted in a geyser of black water and snapping teeth. Something long and segmented whipped out of the froth, wrapping around Eli's thigh with a wet snap. Bone showed through his torn jeans before the blood even welled up. He didn't scream, just locked eyes with me and shoved me the rest of the way up the bank with strength that shouldn't have been left in him. Mia caught me as I sprawled onto solid ground. We turned in time to see Eli brace his boot against a boulder and pull. The creature's segmented body stretched taut, its chitinous plates grinding like broken glass. For one impossible moment, Eli held it. Then his femur snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The creature recoiled, dragging Eli into the frothing water. His mouth opened, not to scream but to laugh, a broken, guttural sound that followed him under. The water boiled where they disappeared. Mia's scream tore through the ravine as the water stilled, unnaturally smooth like glass. My fingers clawed into the mud, nails snapping against hidden roots. The creek's surface reflected nothing. No trees, no sky, just a flat, depthless black. Then it shattered. The explosion of water hit us like a wall, drenching us in freezing spray. Something long and white erupted from the center, Eli's arm, rigid as a post, his fingers splayed in final defiance. It stood there for one impossible second before collapsing backward with a splash. The water swallowed it whole. Mia lunged forward. I caught her jacket just as the bank crumbled beneath her boots. She twisted in my grip, her face a mask of mud and tears. "We have to." The creek went still again, too still, like oil pooling in a wound. Mia trembled against my grip, her jacket sleeve tearing as she strained toward the water. "He's still down there," she gasped, but the words sounded hollow even to me. Eli's arm hadn't moved like something alive. It had moved like a puppet string snapped. The first stone hit the water with a flat plink, then another, and another, pebbles raining down from the ravine's edge above us. Mia's head snapped up. The trees lining the ridge were trembling, their branches clattering together in a wind that didn't touch the creek below. Something dark detached itself from the tree line, a hunched silhouette with too many joints, its elongated fingers drumming against a birch trunk in a grotesque parody of Eli's final gesture. The chuckle came again, but this time it had words woven through it. Salt and iron. Each syllable dripped with mocking familiarity. Mia went rigid. Her hand found mine in the mud, her fingers crushing my knuckles hard enough to grind bone. "Run," she whispered, not to me but to herself, a mantra pulling her upright. We ran. The forest swallowed us whole. Branches whipped at our faces like claws, roots twisted up to snare our ankles, but we didn't stop. Mia's grip on my hand was the only thing anchoring me to reality as we crashed through undergrowth that seemed to recoil from our touch. The air smelled wrong, not of pine and earth, but of wet fur and spoiled meat left too long in the sun. A fallen log loomed ahead, its bark peeling away in strips that curled like fingernails. Mia vaulted over it without breaking stride, her boots kicking up clods of blackened moss. I followed, my lungs burning, and the moment my knee touched the rotten wood, the log moved. Not the whole thing. Just a segment near the middle, bulging outward as something beneath the bark shifted with a sound like cracking knuckles. Mia yanked me forward just as the bark split vertically, revealing a wet red maw lined with teeth that were too small, too numerous. The thing inside the log hissed, its breath reeking of copper and bile. We didn't look back. The trees thinned abruptly, revealing a clearing that shouldn't have existed, a perfect circle of bare earth bisected by a single, dead oak. Its branches were too symmetrical, the twigs at their ends all terminating in identical Y-shapes. Carved into the trunk at eye level was a symbol we'd seen before, a spiral with 7 radiating lines, the grooves dark with something that wasn't sap. Mia skidded to a halt, her chest heaving. "This is where it wants us," Mia finished, her voice cracking. The clearing was too quiet, the air thick with the scent of wet copper. The oak's branches creaked despite the windless air, their Y-shaped tips twisting toward us like skeletal fingers. I grabbed Mia's wrist. "Back now." Mia didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the oak's trunk where the bark had split along the carved symbol, oozing black fluid that streaked downward like tears. The ground beneath our boots trembled, not violently, but subtly, like the shiver of a dreaming animal. The split in the oak widened with a sound like tearing parchment. Black fluid pulsed from the fissure, forming thick ropes that slithered down the trunk and pooled at the base, only to recoil as they touched the symbol carved into the earth. Mia's breath hitched. "Iron," she whispered. "The whole clearing's lined with it." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The bare earth wasn't random. It was a deliberate border, the soil laced with something that made the creature hesitate. The oak's branches groaned louder, their Y-shaped tips trembling with unnatural tension. One twitched violently, snapping toward us like a released spring. Mia jerked me backward just as the branch impaled the spot where we'd stood, the wood sinking 2 feet into the iron-rich soil before recoiling with a frustrated shudder. Mia's grip on my arm tightened suddenly, not in fear, but recognition. Her gaze snapped past me, past the shuddering oak, to where a lone birch stood at the clearing's edge. Its pale bark was studded with rusted iron nails arranged in a jagged spiral, their positions mirroring the exact pattern Eli had scratched into the cave wall with his broken wrist. The branches weren't pointing at us at all. They were trembling toward the birch like compass needles seeking true north. "Salt and iron," Mia breathed. She took a step backward, dragging me with her. The oak's branches creaked in protest, their twigs straining against some invisible force. One snapped free with a sound like a breaking bone, embedding itself in the iron-laced soil where it writhed like a speared worm. The birch's nails glistened with more than rust. Black fluid seeped from each puncture point, tracing downward in perfect vertical lines, too deliberate to be sap. The pattern was unmistakable now, 7 radiating lines intersecting a spiral. A ward, a warning, a trail. The birch's rusted nails suddenly glowed cherry red with heat, their iron cores reacting violently with the creature's black ichor. The metal sizzled where the fluid touched it, sending up curls of acrid smoke that stung our eyes. Between the nails, the ground shimmered, not with heat, but with the faint, crystalline gleam of old salt embedded in the soil. A path, narrow, barely wider than my shoulders, but unmistakably there. Mia didn't hesitate. She dragged me forward, her boots kicking up puffs of white powder as we stumbled onto the salted ground. The oak behind us screamed, a sound like splitting wood and tearing flesh, but its branches recoiled from the border, twitching violently as if caught in an invisible web. The birch's nails pulsed brighter, their glow casting long, wavering shadows that didn't match the angle of the setting sun. The path ahead twisted unnaturally, the trees on either side leaning away to form a tunnel of gnarled trunks and twisted branches. The air here was colder, thinner, like breathing at the peak of a mountain. Mia's grip on my hand tightened as we ran. "Don't step off the salt," she hissed. Her voice was raw, frayed at the edges. The salted path ended abruptly at a fallen birch, its trunk split down the middle like a gutted animal. Mia hesitated, her boots scuffing the last crystalline grains embedded in the soil. Beyond the tree, an ordinary-looking deer trail wound into the undergrowth, too normal, too untouched. I felt it before I heard it, the forest behind us exhaling. A rush of air thick with the stench of rotten leaves and wet fur pressed against our backs. Mia's fingers dug into my arm as the trees began to move. Not bending, rearranging. Birches slid sideways like chess pieces, their roots tearing free of the earth with grotesque sucking sounds. The salted path collapsed inward, swallowed whole by the shifting woods. Within seconds, only unbroken forest remained, the trees standing shoulder to shoulder like sentinels guarding a grave. Mia didn't look back. She stepped onto the deer trail with the care of someone testing thin ice. The moment her boot left the last speck of salt, the air changed, thinner, sharper, like the high-altitude gasp before a storm breaks. The deer trail unraveled into nothing halfway down the slope, leaving us stumbling through waist-high ferns that hissed against our torn clothes. Mia's breath came in sharp, wet gasps beside me, her elbow jutting against mine like a broken wing. Then the trees thinned, not gradually, but violently, as if yanked apart by unseen hands, and the world opened onto a highway guardrail. Its metal was warm to the touch, humming faintly with the memory of passing cars. I clung to it like a shipwrecked survivor to driftwood, my palms stinging where the rust bit into raw flesh. Beyond the embankment, asphalt shimmered under the first pale streaks of dawn. Then headlights crested the distant hill, two pinpricks of gold that shouldn't have been beautiful but were, impossibly, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Mia made a sound like a sob caught in her throat. She vaulted the guardrail before the truck was even fully visible, her boots skidding on gravel as she hit the shoulder. The driver wouldn't stop. Why would they? Two bloodied kids staggering out of nowhere at sunrise, our clothes shredded, our faces streaked with things better left unexamined. I opened my mouth to shout, but my voice had dissolved somewhere back in the birches. The truck slowed anyway. Its brakes whined protest as it rolled to a stop 30 yards past us. The door swung open before the engine even cut, and a man stepped out, not cautiously, but with the deliberate stride of someone who'd seen worse. His flannel shirt was frayed at the cuffs, his boots caked with drywall mud. A carpenter. A father, probably. The kind of man who stopped for hitchhikers because his daughter might need that kindness someday. The carpenter's gaze swept over us, Mia's torn jacket, my mud-caked boots, the way we trembled like saplings in a storm. His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Back seat," he said, jerking his chin toward the truck. "Not get in. Not come here. Just back seat like we were stray dogs he didn't trust not to bite." Mia moved first, her boots crunching gravel as she circled wide. The truck's interior smelled of pine air freshener and old coffee. I collapsed onto the bench seat, my knees giving out as adrenaline bled from my muscles. The vinyl stuck to my bloody palms. The carpenter didn't ask, just leaned in, his work-roughened fingers brushing my wrist as he checked my pulse. His touch was startlingly warm, alive. "Ranger station's 10 miles east," he said finally. His voice was low, gravelly with lack of sleep. "Or ER's 20 west." Mia's breath hitched. "East," she whispered. The man nodded once, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, not at us but at the tree line behind the truck. His fingers tapped the steering wheel twice. A habit, a tell. The truck's engine roared to life, vibrating through my bones like a second heartbeat. Mia slumped against the window, her reflection fractured by the spiderweb of cracks in the glass. The carpenter's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, not checking on us but scanning the tree line as we accelerated. The forest blurred into a solid wall of green, but for one chilling moment I swore I saw a pale shape keeping pace between the trunks. Then it was gone. Mia's fingers found mine in the space between the seats, crushing hard enough to hurt. The carpenter saw. His knuckles whitened on the wheel, but he said nothing. Just turned the heater up until hot air scoured the scent of wet earth and iron from the cab. We hit the ranger station at 6:03 a.m. The carpenter idled at the edge of the parking lot, his fingers drumming the wheel in that same uneven rhythm. A lone ranger shuffled across the asphalt with a steaming thermos, his uniform wrinkled from night shift. He froze when he saw us tumbling out of the truck, two bloodied kids with hollow eyes and twig-tangled hair. The carpenter rolled down his window. "Found 'em off Route 9, he said, too casual. Said they got separated from their hiking group. The ranger's gaze lingered on Mia's hands, clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood. His walkie-talkie crackled to life with a burst of static that made us both flinch. "We'll take it from here," he said slowly, but the carpenter was already pulling away, his tires kicking up gravel. The ranger station smelled like stale coffee and gun oil. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting jaundiced shadows that made Mia's face look skeletal. The ranger, name tag reading Henderson, leaned across the counter, his pen hovering over a missing person's form. "You said there were 5 of you." Mia's fingers twitched against the styrofoam cup of lukewarm water they'd given her. I watched her throat work as she swallowed whatever truth wanted to claw its way out. "3 now," she whispered. Henderson's pen stilled. Behind him, a bulletin board displayed sun-bleached flyers for lost hikers. One dated back to 1987. The radio crackled again. This time the voice was clearer. * possible bear attack near Devil's Run. The ranger's pen hovered longer than necessary before he wrote anything down. His knuckles were white around the cheap plastic. "Bear attack," he repeated, voice flat. The radio squawked again, something about torn clothing and too much blood for a survivable mauling. Mia's fingers twitched toward mine under the counter, her nails biting into my palm like she was anchoring herself to something solid. The ranger's pen hovered over the form too long, too still, before scribbling "bear attack" with a grim finality that made my stomach drop. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. Henderson tore the form from its perforated edge with deliberate slowness. "We'll organize a search party by noon," he said, but his eyes flicked to the bulletin board behind him, to those sun-faded flyers curling at the edges. His thumb rubbed absently over a faint, crescent-shaped scar on his wrist. Mia's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream, to tell him about the thing with too many joints and teeth like cracked ice, but the radio crackled to life again. "Confirmed sighting near mile marker 12, *, a pause. Then quieter. Found another one of those damn carvings." Henderson's jaw clenched. He slid the form into a filing cabinet without looking at it. "You kids need medical." His voice was too steady, like he'd practiced this exact conversation before. The vinyl seat stuck to my thighs when I stood. Mia stayed frozen, her gaze locked on the bulletin board where a new flyer had already been pinned, fresh paper, crisp edges. A grainy trail cam photo showed a blur of motion between the trees. Too tall, too thin. The vinyl peeled away from my thighs with a sound like tearing skin. Mia still hadn't moved. Her coffee sat untouched, the steam curling into the shape of a question mark. Henderson watched us with the careful neutrality of a man who'd seen too many kids stumble out of those woods with that same hollow stare. The vinyl seat sighed as Mia finally stood, her coffee trembling in her grip. She set it down without drinking, slowly, carefully, like she feared any sudden movement might wake something. Henderson watched us with the exhausted patience of a man who'd played this scene before. His fingers drummed the countertop, the rhythm syncopated, like he was counting seconds between radio bursts. The walkie crackled again. "Team at marker 12 reports no contact." Static swallowed the rest. Henderson's thumb twitched toward the volume knob but didn't turn it. Instead, he reached under the counter and slid 2 laminated maps toward us. One showed hiking trails in cheerful green. The other was older, its edges yellowed, with a handwritten notation in the corner: "Salt lines. Iron nails. Don't trust the birch groves." Mia's breath hitched. Her fingers hovered over the second map like she wanted to touch it but feared it might crumble. Henderson cleared his throat. "You'll want to stick to marked trails," he said, tapping the green map. His nail left a smudge on the laminate, "especially near Devil's Run." The radio hissed, "Footprints heading west." The laminated map trembled in Mia's hands as Henderson's radio squawked again, this time with a burst of static so loud it made the overhead lights flicker. Mia flinched, her fingers tightening around the map's edge until the plastic creased. Behind the counter, Henderson didn't react, just stared at the radio with the resigned exhaustion of a man who'd spent decades listening to screams drowned out by white noise. Mia's voice was raw when she finally spoke. "You know what's out there." Not a question, a statement. Henderson's thumb rubbed that crescent scar again. "I know what isn't." His gaze flicked to the bulletin board, to the grainy trail cam photo of something too tall lurking between the trees. "Search parties go in. They don't always come back. And the ones that do," he trailed off, nodding at the filing cabinet where our bear attack report now sat. The radio crackled again, a voice breaking through the static. "Found another water bottle. Red bandana tied to it." Mia's knees buckled. I caught her elbow, feeling the tremors racking her body. Darren's bandana, a taunt, a trophy. The vinyl chair groaned under Mia's weight as she collapsed back into it. Henderson's gaze lingered on her shaking hands before he turned abruptly, rummaging in a drawer. He slammed a dented flask onto the counter, the metal scratched with symbols that mirrored the ones carved into Eli's forearm. "Drink," he ordered. The liquid inside smelled like turpentine and burnt honey. Mia gagged after the first sip, but color seeped back into her cheeks. Henderson watched with grim satisfaction before pocketing the flask. His radio erupted again, this time a garbled shout cut mid-word. The static that followed had a rhythm to it, almost like laughter. The radio's static laughter died abruptly as Henderson slammed his palm down on the power button. The silence that followed was worse, thick, expectant, like the woods holding its breath before a strike. Mia's fingers dug into the laminate map, her knuckles blanching around the edges of Devil's Run. Henderson exhaled through his nose, the sound uneven. "There's a bus stop half a mile east," he said, too carefully. "Next one leaves at 7:15. He didn't say get on it, didn't have to." Mia stood abruptly, the chair screeching against linoleum. The trail cam photo fluttered in the draft, a blur of elongated limbs frozen mid-stride. Henderson intercepted us at the door, his grip surprisingly gentle as he pressed a slip of paper into my hand. A phone number, ink smudged from sweat. "Call when you're somewhere with steel doors," he muttered. "Ask for the warden." Outside, dawn bled across the parking lot in watery streaks. Mia's pace quickened as we passed the bulletin board, its pinned edges rustling like dry leaves despite the windless air. The bus stop materialized at the tree line, its bench warped by decades of rain. A schedule bolted to the shelter listed destinations in faded type: Mill Creek, Silverton, Ashford. The bus arrived precisely at 7:14, its diesel growl startling a murder of crows from the pines. The driver, a woman with salt and pepper braids, froze when she saw us boarding. Her gaze flicked to the woods behind us, then to the fresh scratches on Mia's forearms. She didn't ask for tickets, just jerked her chin toward the empty back seats. The bus seats smelled like stale vinyl and industrial cleaner, the kind that never quite masks the sour tang of old sweat. Mia slumped against the window, her breath fogging the glass in uneven bursts. Outside, the trees blurred into a solid mass of green, too uniform, too still, like they were holding their breath. The driver's eyes found mine in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" she asked, though the way her fingers tightened on the wheel said she already knew. "Ashford," I croaked. The name tasted like rust and salt. She didn't respond, just punched the accelerator hard enough to slam us back into the seats. The engine roared like a living thing as we peeled onto the highway, leaving the ranger station shrinking in the dust. The bus windows rattled as we hit 60, the vibration traveling up my spine like a second pulse. Mia's reflection in the glass was a ghost, pale, fractured, her eyes fixed on the tree line shrinking behind us. The driver's knuckles stayed white on the wheel long after the last pines vanished from view. At the 3rd-mile marker, the static from the bus radio resolved into a news bulletin. Asterisk, authorities have called off the search for missing hikers near Devil's Run. Mia's breath hitched. The reporter's voice was polished, professional. Believed to have been attacked by wildlife. The driver's hand twitched toward the dial but didn't turn it off. Her eyes flicked to me in the mirror again, not pitying but knowing. The kind of look you give someone standing at the edge of a cliff. Mia's fingers found mine in the gap between seats, her grip feverish. Her palm was tacky with half-dried blood. Eli S. Jake S. Mine, the lines blurred. The bus hit a pothole, jolting us sideways. My shoulder hit the window, and for one vertigo-inducing second the glass wasn't glass at all, but black water so still it reflected nothing. Then it passed. The bus windows stopped rattling when we crossed the county line. The trees here were shorter, farther apart, normal in ways that made my skin crawl. Mia exhaled through her nose, her breath fogging the glass in slow, uneven circles. At mile marker 12, the radio hissed to life with a burst of static. The driver's shoulders tensed, but she didn't reach for the dial. A voice crackled through, too garbled to understand, before cutting out abruptly. The silence afterward was worse. Mia's fingers dug into my wrist hard enough to leave crescent marks. The driver cleared her throat. Ashford's next stop. Her eyes flicked to the rearview again. You got people waiting. Mia's thumb rubbed over the smudged phone number Henderson had given us. Yeah, she lied. The bus shuddered to a halt outside a diner with flickering neon. Asterisk Roy's all-night asterisk, the E dark. The driver kept the engine running as we stood, her fingers drumming the wheel. Steel doors, she muttered as we passed her. It wasn't advice. It was an order. The diner's door screeched like a wounded animal when we pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease. The vinyl booths cracked with age. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead, its uneven rotation casting stuttering shadows across Mia's hollowed-out face. The only other patron was an old man hunched over the counter, his fingers wrapped around a mug as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. We slid into a booth by the window. Mia's hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the tabletop, like she was testing its reality. The laminate was cool beneath my own palms, sticky with decades of syrup spills. Normal. Wrongly, terrifyingly normal. The waitress appeared without greeting, her pen poised over a notepad. Her name tag read Dottie, the letters faded. Up close, I noticed the yellowing bruise peeking from her collar, the way her left pupil dilated slightly slower than the right. Her gaze lingered on Mia's shredded jacket, the dirt caked under my nails. You kids need a phone, she asked, too casual. Her knuckles whitened around the pen. Mia's fingers hovered over the diner's payphone receiver, trembling like a compass needle caught between poles. The moment she lifted it, the line emitted a wet crackle, that same arrhythmic static from Henderson's radio, like something breathing through clenched teeth. Then the whisper came, so close it might have been inside her skull. You left your map. The receiver hit the floor with a clatter that turned every head in the diner. Dottie's coffee pot slipped from her grip, shattering against the linoleum in a burst of glass and scalding liquid. The old man at the counter didn't flinch, just rotated his mug slowly, revealing a crude spiral carved into its underside, the grooves dark with old coffee stains. Tires screeched outside. A rusted pickup skidded to a stop at the diner's curb, its bed loaded with scrap metal and its driver's door already swinging open. The woman behind the wheel wore welding gloves and a flannel shirt with the sleeves ripped off, exposing forearms laddered with thin white scars. Get in, she barked, not asking, not explaining. We moved without thinking. The truck's cab reeked of motor oil and something sharper, camphor maybe or crushed juniper berries. As the engine roared to life, the welder shoved a grease-stained bandana into Mia's hands. Wipe your prints off everything, she ordered, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where the diner's neon sign shrank behind us. Mia obeyed mechanically, scrubbing at the door handle, the seatbelt buckle, the smudged window glass where our faces had pressed. The welder's knuckles whitened on the wheel as we hit the highway. "City limits in 20, she muttered, more to herself than us. The glove compartment popped open when we hit a pothole, spilling loose nails across the floorboards, each one filed to a vicious point and dark with what looked like old blood. Mia and I exchanged a glance but said nothing. Some questions didn't need answers. The city swallowed us whole. Its skyline rose like a graveyard of steel and glass, the jagged edges cutting through the smog-choked dusk. Mia pressed her forehead against the truck's passenger window, her breath fogging the glass in uneven bursts. The welder, whose name we never learned, had dumped us at a bus terminal on the outskirts with a muttered "Don't come back," and a handful of iron nails clenched in her fist like rosary beads. We didn't look behind us. Not when the bus pulled away from the terminal, not when the last strip of forest vanished beneath the sprawl of strip malls and parking lots. Mia's fingers found mine in the dark space between seats, her grip tight enough to grind bone. Her palms were still tacky with Eli's blood. The city air tasted like exhaust and wet concrete. We slept in the back booth of a 24-hour diner the first night, nursing coffees we couldn't afford to waste until the morning shift manager took pity and didn't kick us out. The fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects overhead, casting greenish shadows under Mia's hollowed-out eyes. Every time the door chimed, we flinched, not from fear of the cops or social workers, but from the irrational certainty that one of those shadows would stretch too long, its edges fraying into antlered silhouettes. By the third day, we'd scrubbed the forest from our skin in the harsh glow of a laundromat bathroom. Mia's jacket went into a donation bin outside a thrift store, the cuffs still stiff with Jake's dried blood. We watched from across the street as a homeless man fished it out, his fingers pausing over the dark stains before shrugging it on without hesitation. Mia's fingers twitched toward her jacket cuff, the new one, stiff with thrift store starch instead of blood, before she catches herself. The subway car rattles beneath us, its flickering lights casting our reflections in the grimy windows. For a split second, the glass doesn't show our faces at all but the birch grove's shifting branches. I blink and it's gone. "Never going back," she whispers. Not to me, to the ghost of Eli's voice in the shuddering metal around us. The words taste like a lie even as I nod because the truth is, we never left. Not really. The forest lives in the way coffee steam curling upward makes us flinch, in how crowds parting around us feel like trees swaying aside. The city's steel canyons are just another kind of trap. Her knee bounces against mine under the diner table. We've been here 3 hours nursing the same burnt coffee, watching the door. The waitress, a different one now with a name tag reading Janice, has stopped refilling our cups. Mia traces the whorls in the laminate with her thumbnail, following patterns that aren't quite spirals. Not quite. "You think Henderson knew?" she asks suddenly. Her voice is too loud in the nearly empty diner. I picture the ranger's crescent scar, the way his fingers hesitated over our report. "He's still there," I say instead of answering. That's worse somehow, that he knows and stays. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed like flies over carrion, casting long shadows that didn't match the angle of the setting sun outside. Mia's coffee had gone cold, the creamer congealing into oily swirls that almost resembled the spiral carved into Eli's forearm. I reached for my own cup just to feel something solid, but the ceramic was wrong, too light, too smooth. When I lifted it, the underside revealed a crude etching, a single line intersecting a half circle, the symbol from the birch grove. My fingers spasmed. The cup hit the floor with a sound like a skull splitting on stone. Janice didn't come to clean it up. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, their glow swallowed by the creeping dark between buildings. Mia's reflection in the window was a ghost, pale, fractured, her pupils dilated too wide for the diner's brightness. Her lips moved silently, shaping words I knew by heart, never going back. The lie curdled between us.